You're listening to newstreamingnetwork.com, home of goingsolomedia.com and WGSN-DB Going Solo Network Radio, Podcast, and TV. Welcome to Divorce Coalition Live, a show designed for divorce professionals to enhance the divorce process to prevent re-traumatization of domestic abuse survivors. I'm your host, Jill Kaufman, therapist, divorce coach, and co-parenting expert. And you can get in touch with me at info@divorcecoachjill.com and www.divorcecoachjill.com. The Divorce Coalition is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing education and awareness of divorce professionals and process change to create a more supportive and less traumatic divorce experience. We have united top podcast hosts and divorce professionals to create systematic change in the divorce process for domestic abuse victims. With 23.5% of divorces citing domestic violence as a cause, we bring you expert guests, practical advice, and enlightening conversations. Knowledge is power in creating change in the world of divorce with domestic abuse. So without further ado, let's get started. When a survivor of domestic abuse is going through divorce, they are often confronted with someone who has a personality disorder. Divorcing a person with a personality disorder brings with it specific challenges, including the person being resistant to change and using the court to control and further abuse their former partner. Today, I'm asking my guest, Bill Eddy, to share his expertise with personality disorders and high conflict divorce to provide tools and resources on how to help clients divorce in an effective way, even if their former partner has a personality disorder. Bill Eddy is one of our experts and has been a therapist since 1980 and a family lawyer since 1992. Bill was the senior family mediator at the National Conflict Resolution Center based in San Diego. Bill is the co-founder and chief innovation officer of the High Conflict Institute and the author of over 20 books, manuals, and workbooks, including Splitting, Protecting Yourself While Divorcing Someone with Borderline or Narcissistic Personality Disorder, which is one of my biggest recommendations for my clients. So, Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Jill. Glad to be on.
Well, is there anything I missed about you that you want to add?
Just that I've been very busy. You can tell.
A lot of divorces.
Yeah. But what's interesting is combining mental health as a licensed clinical social worker with law in California as a certified family law specialist for 15 years. That's how I really came to see the high conflict personality and personality disorder connection. Because in family court, people talked about high conflict families. And I said, no, it's not high conflict families, it's high conflict personalities. Some families may have one, some may have two. But we see, for example, with domestic violence, that you have one person with a personality disorder and the other person trying to protect the kids, etc. And so they're kind of mislabeling the problem, but also by understanding the individual and individual personality disorders, we have a much better idea what to do and what not to do. So that's how that all came together for me.
Yeah. Oh, it's so important to understand that because so you don't put the blame on both parties and you understand how you deal with it in an effective way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, what is the connection between domestic violence and personality disorders?
So here's what's interesting, because I always felt that there was a connection, but for a lot of years, people said there's no mental health disorder that goes with domestic violence. And in the old days, since you're also a social worker, mental health professional, in the old days there was Axis 1 and Axis 2 in diagnosing mental disorders, and Axis 1 was kind of what you can see. So schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, bipolar, all of that was Axis 1. Axis 2 was personality disorders, and kind of more fundamental. I think of it like the program in a computer, you can change and update your program, but personality disorders is like your computer. And so it's more fundamental, much harder to change. And so I just felt like this is probably personality disorders, but I wasn't really clear exactly. But the patterns of behavior, because as you mentioned, in 1980, I became a therapist. I worked in psychiatric hospitals, outpatient clinics, and I worked with personality disorders. In fact, in 1980, the DSM-3, that's the diagnostic manual, came out, and two people from the committee came to our clinic and told us about personality disorders. It's a new category in the DSM-3, and here's kind of what the problems are. And then as a social worker, like in the psychiatric hospital, what I learned was I could help solve one problem, like family, like a couple relationship, and then they'd have a problem with their employer, and then they'd have a problem with their boss. And so it was a pattern of problems that never stopped. So the connection became clearer to me. Domestic violence, very hard to treat. And I'm going, well, maybe why it's hard to treat is because we're not understanding what it is. And when you understand personality disorders, basically a rigid pattern of behavior, a narrower pattern of behavior than most personalities, and that it's in several different settings and it's very unlikely to change, but it's not absolute. But it's harder to treat, say, than addiction. And so the connection finally, because I started talking about this in family court as a family lawyer. I remember 94, I had a case. My client was victim of domestic violence, probably beat up 40 times in the 6-year marriage. And the husband was ordered to go to domestic violence treatment group for 52 weeks. And anyway, they were the pattern in court was we'd be back in court every 6 to 12 months because dad wanted control of the boy because he lost control of the wife, but he wanted control of the boy. And so I submitted what they call a points and authorities. It's kind of a background paper with my court hearing papers. At the end of the hearing, the judge made his decision. Then he said, Mr. Eddy, I read your paper on personality disorders, and I fail to see the connection and relevance. Anyway, but that's not the end of the story. So we're back every year for 3 years. By the third year, the judge orders sanctions. That's a financial penalty on the father for bringing a meritless hearing. And he said, sir, I don't understand how you think, but I'm starting to agree with Mr. Eddy.
It took 3 years for the judge to agree to see it.
Unfortunately. But then I saw this connection, this overlap, and I wrote a book, High Conflict People and Legal Disputes. So judges, lawyers, psychologists started wanting training in this, but I still didn't have the direct connection, personality disorders and high conflict behavior, domestic violence, child abuse, all of that in family court. Well, recently there's an article that I read, okay, here's the connection. And so the research basically says, and I'll give you the title of this article. I have to find it again. But
That's
this
okay.
article is personality disorders as predictors of intimate partner violence, a meta-analysis. So this is a study, and this came out in 2021, and that looked at 163 other studies and put them all together and came to this conclusion. It is clear that disordered personality plays a significant role in IPV, intimate partner violence, perpetration and victimization, and that there's a higher incidence, higher involvement in domestic violence by all the personality disorders, but two in particular that I'm quite familiar with. One is borderline personality disorder, and the other is antisocial personality disorder. So some of the dynamics of borderline personality disorder is a fear of abandonment, loss of attachment. And that's very much what we see in a significant percent of the coercive, controlling, violent behavior, because they're trying to keep their partner from walking out on them. And that's why the time of separation is one of the most dangerous times, because they'll do anything to cling to their partner, including kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, people don't understand, how can that be? Well, here's how I think it's easiest to see. Picture a 3-year-old. Picture mom says, "Sonny, I'm going to move out. Good luck." And so kids instinctively react with anger to abandonment. They kick your knees, they punch your knees, and it's all consuming. It's like life or death. And what happens is these personalities haven't matured, so they still have the early childhood dynamics, and it feels like life or death. And so their reaction is so disproportionate and often out of control that they harm the person that they love. Understanding this pattern tells us a lot: what to do, what not to do. But let me talk about antisocial and then talk more about that and give you a chance to say something.
Yeah, no, this is great. This is really good.
So, antisocial personality disorder has a different wiring. In fact, this is one that may be the most genetic. So it passes from generation to generation. The diagnostic manual says this is the personality disorder that's most likely to be passed generation to generation. So there's a biological element to this. There's various factors of that, but in general, they're very invested in dominance, and power and control is part of their personality. Now, not all antisocial people are violent, but many are. And this is the one that this research said stands out the most, because in many ways they're predatory. They want to control, dominate, may control everything about the person. You know, I've got cases where they control what the person eats, what the person weighs, as well as how they spend their money, if they can get some money to spend. Um, all of that, but they're invested in dominance, whereas borderline is invested in attachment. And so both of these are invested in control of their partners. So just fundamentally, some things to think about this is someone has this pattern and they're very resistant to change. So a mistake people make a lot, and this is professionals as well as partners, is to argue with the person. You're not going to change their, can you imagine arguing with your computer? Well, actually, I do sometimes, but it's pointless. It's this programmed to be doing what it's doing. And the other thing is trying to reason with the person. It is one problem I see in family court, is the judges try to reason um, with domestic abusers. And, sir, you really can't do that. You have to cut it out. And and get into these arguments. But the other thing is, both of these personalities are very skilled at manipulating people. And it's just astonishing how well they manipulate professionals. And then professionals become what I call negative advocates, and absorb their client's point of view of the world and then promote that. And I think it's really unconscionable to not check out, is this really what's happening? Are you defending something you really know something about? So that's kind of the beginning of the discussion.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have so many questions for you. You brought up so many good, interesting and important points. First of all, are all domestic abusers do all of them have a personality disorder? I just wanted to ask that one.
I'd say no, because there's different types of domestic abuse. So in it's about 15 years ago, there was in family court, there was family law professionals and domestic violence professionals kind of got together and looked at four patterns of behavior. So the coercive controlling violence is what we think of the most. And this is with coercive control, perhaps physical injuries, all of that. Another is what they called situational couple violence, which is more pushing and shoving. And coercive controlling violence is heavily male, about 85 to 90% are men, maybe 10% women. And I've had some clients where women were the perpetrator, but far and away is a male behavior. Situational couple violence is fairly equally male and female, and often and maybe rarely has personality disorders. It's a lack of conflict resolution skills, and people can be trained, and people without personality disorders learn and grow and change. I teach law students, and I ask them, do you think your personality has changed over the last 10 years? And they're like around 25 years old. And they almost all raise their hands. I used to be quiet, now I talk more, I this, I that. But personality disorders are rigid personalities. They don't they resist change, and consciously and unconsciously. Yeah, I forgot what the question was.
Well, the question is, are all domestic violence abusers, do they have personality disorders?
Right. So there's coercive controlling violence, situational couple violence, usually not associated with personality disorders. There's separation instigated violence, where there may be one or two incidents at the time of separation, but there's no history of violence. And so that's, emotions took over in a very, very intense moment. I've had cases where, the two are at home and they're fighting over a piece of paper. That's mine. No, that's mine. And knock the person down just because of the force of fighting for the paper. Nobody gets seriously hurt. I had a case like that, and both parties were so shocked. It's like the guy was like, I gotta get out of here, and I am going to stay away. There's no way I want to risk this happening again. That was not personality disorders. Fourth type is violent resistance, where the target of or the victim survivor of domestic abuse fights back. And you hear about these cases, sometimes they shoot the perpetrator in the middle of the night and kill them and go to prison for that. Battered wife syndrome. Most people, when they fight back, everybody's awake, and usually the woman who's fighting back gets seriously injured. So it's not recommended. That's not a solution. So those four types, the first type, the coercive controlling violence, is the one that I believe is primarily personality disorders, because most people don't want that. Most people don't do that. And most men don't do that. We're looking at, at most maybe 20% of men involved in any of those. But it's more like 5 to 10% that are involved in the coercive controlling violence. And they don't necessarily have a lot of control over that, which we really have to recognize when it comes to treatment. But generally, I would say the coercive controlling violence is pretty strongly associated with personality disorders. Now, saying that, I want to say the flip side. Not everybody with a personality disorder is a perpetrator of domestic violence.
Of course, yes, right.
So, like, someone may be diagnosed having borderline personality disorder who's not violent at all. And probably the majority of people with borderline personality disorder aren't violent. And this study points that out.
Right.
I'd be suspicious of antisocial personality disorder. I think it's possible that the majority are violent, but that's just from personal observation.
That's really interesting because you didn't mention narcissistic personality disorder, and I
Right.
just wanted to follow up on that. There is domestic violence with that personality disorder, just not as high as the borderline and the antisocial, correct?
Right. But I'm so glad you brought that up because I want to talk about that. There still is a higher incidence of domestic violence with narcissistic personality disorder than the average population. What's interesting, though, is the dynamics of narcissistic personalities. They're generally two types. There's the grandiose narcissist, who in many ways is more similar to antisocial in that they may be offended by something their partner does, but they're so confident in themselves that they're not triggered like the vulnerable narcissist. So actually, let me talk about the vulnerable narcissist in more detail. The vulnerable narcissist has been studied the most, and there's a lot of mental health theory that vulnerable narcissists have a core of shame that they developed in childhood, and that their coping mechanism is narcissism. So they may have been brutally abused physically, emotionally, sexually, whatever, in childhood. And their coping mechanism was, I'm superior. That's why people pick on me. And they go through life trying to show how superior they are. But since no one's superior as a person, maybe people are better at this, better at that, they're constantly having that, what they call false self, um, run into trouble. And they don't look so hot. They aren't so superior.
Yeah.
And that's what we call a narcissistic injury. And when that happens, they feel their core of shame and they're very angry and want to fight against the loss of their image. And so they react, in a sense, with hot anger, like the borderline personality reacts with hot anger at being abandoned. So for borderline, it's being abandoned. And for narcissists, it's being exposed, basically, is
So,
not superior.
I have to stop you because we have to take a break, but this is so interesting and important. We just have to take a break and we'll come right back. Domestic abuse survivors experience a lack of trust in the divorce and legal systems in place to protect them. Research shows that many report re-traumatization in court and reported that legal professionals verbally threatened them, mocked them, did not give them a chance to speak in court, exaggerated the survivor's faults in court, and provoked them to elicit emotional reactions. In other cases, divorce professionals may be the first point of contact for survivors with the ability to help if they recognize the signs. The Divorce Coalition is a nonprofit organization created to change this experience for abuse victims and survivors through education and awareness of divorce professionals. For more information, go to www.divorcecoalition.com and please support us by making a tax-deductible donation at www.divorcecoalition.com/donate-now. And now back to the show. Okay, so just continue where you were because you were talking about the hot anger at being
Yeah.
that
So,
was great.
so the borderline pattern seems to have reactive hot anger. It's like sudden, by surprise, often. The person, like their emotions take over and they just react. And with borderline, this is what we've traditionally thought of as the cycle of violence. There's the buildup of tension, explosion of rage, and then a period of remorse. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again. But they do because it's a narrow personality pattern. I think that the vulnerable narcissist has a lot of similarities to that their narcissistic injury, that they're exposed and they're angry about being exposed. And they might be exposed at work as not so superior. In fact, they may be threatened with the loss of their job. They come home and they take it out on their spouse or partner because they're angry and they're like, where do I displace this anger? The grandiose narcissist, I believe, grew up learning that they're superior rather than having a core of shame. Is they are really solid about, I'm a superior person and people need to treat me this way. And if you don't treat me this way, I'm going to punish you. I'll get around to it. I'm not sure how or when, but you'll suffer. And it's a cold, almost predatory, like antisocial. So while the study didn't point out narcissists as high of an incidence as borderline and antisocial, it's still higher than average. And I think as a family law professional that I see borderline narcissistic and antisocial as the most common perpetrators of a lot of problems in family court. Violence, false allegations, lying, willingness to use the court to humiliate their partner. All three of these are willing to do that.
And I bet that the narcissistic personality disorder may not go to domestic violence in terms of physical violence, but there's a lot of emotional abuse, and that's a lot harder to quantify when you do studies, right?
Yes, in fact, when I was a therapist, I had adults who had been physically abused, sexually abused as children. And I remember this one woman with one of the worst physical abuse histories saying that the physical abuse wasn't as bad as the emotional abuse, that she absorbed an image of herself that was terrible. She hated herself, and she had absorbed what her parent had told her. So narcissists are really good at verbal abuse.
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
so you're right. You're absolutely right that often it's not the physical abuse. And what's interesting to me, I spoke a couple times in England last year, and they really have adopted the term domestic abuse. And in the US, we still use domestic violence, but really looking at it, it really goes beyond physical incidents of violence. And many of my clients who were victim survivors of domestic violence, it wasn't every day, maybe once a year. Like the one woman I mentioned beat up 40 times in a 6-year marriage. But the control was every minute.
Right. Right. And that control,
And it
is
extended into the court case.
right.
We were in court probably over 6 years. And the case I told you where I wrote the points and authorities about personality disorder, the issue the judge changed, and the issue that year was where the boy plays soccer. And in mom's community, and she had primary physical custody, and where she had lived, and he was trying to get more and more time and stuff. And so we're fighting over his community or her community. And the judge started calling the case, oh, this is the soccer case. And I was like, no, this is a domestic violence case. And he's just continuing through soccer.
Right. Right. Well, so let's get to that about the courtroom. Like what are some tools that we can use as divorce professionals to deal with and help our clients when they're dealing with any of these personality disorders and they're divorcing them?
Yeah. I think really focusing your presentation, and when I say your presentation, 80% of people in California, at least, represent themselves in family court. And so it really is something that, I teach lawyers, but I teach individuals too. And I want to go back to the book Splitting, which you mentioned you found really helpful. Is in there, I talk about, in chapter 14, I talk about presenting your case and focusing on the three most concerning patterns of behavior and identifying 3 or 4 of the strongest examples of those concerning patterns of behavior, so that what's presented to the judge has like 3 headlines. Because what happens in family court and why perpetrators are so successful is they keep it simple, emotional, and repetitive. And so the answer to that is keep it simple, keep it repetitive. So you have your three headings, and then with somewhat emotional words. So it may be physical abuse, of father's physical abuse of mother, and the three strongest examples. I had a client. I said, tell me some about what happened, and then she says one day, well, he knocked me unconscious. He knocked you on. What do you mean? He shoved me against the cabinet, the wall cabinet, so hard that I was unconscious. And I said, oh, wow, when was that? And she said, well, I'm not sure. What year? Well, I'm not sure. And so I had to really help her get in touch with when these things happened, what the dynamics were, because that's extreme. And I think that a judge would want to know. The mistake that family law professionals and self-representing people make in family court, and this is, I think, a huge mistake, is they tell the story from the beginning. And let's say they submit a document 10 pages long, and here's the problem. And they say, and we got married, and then he started being abusive after the first year, and this, and this happened. And on page 8 is, and he knocked me unconscious. Well, guess what? By page 8,
they're not reading that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you gotta get this like in the first 2 pages. If you're writing something, and I recommend that people write this out, 3 headlines, and common headlines are, physical abuse, emotional abuse of children, or maybe physical abuse of children, and undermining mother's relationship with the children, false statements or misleading statements, or false and misleading statements. So you come up with 3 or 4 worst examples so that the judge gets a sense of how extreme is this case. And one of the things that I find helpful is for people to say, because the courts, each judge, at least where I've practiced in California, primarily San Diego, each judge has about 3,000 cases a year. And so they're really thinking, how do I move this case through? And so they see cases similarly. And there's a presumption that's not written, that's been in family court since about 1980. And that is, it's an equal parent conflict. Both people, one person says the other's an alcoholic, they're probably both alcoholics. One says the other's lying, they're probably both lying. That there's this sense, and it came from the mental health field, because we talk about family systems, everyone contributes to the family system. Well, that's true, but not everyone is engaged in violence. And that was a big shift for me when I became a lawyer from being a clinical social worker, is, yeah, the family still has family system dynamics, but one person has dangerous behavior that needs to be stopped. And so that's a big part of that. Anyway, I get long-winded sometimes. I forget where I started. What was the question?
I basically, what you were going over is how we can help our clients present themselves in court.
Yeah.
And this is so helpful, because I have a client right now who's trying to defend themselves, and even stating those 3 things up front and then going into each of those things so that they see that right away, I think would be a great idea for my client.
And what I encourage, they write it out in like a 2-page, statement. In California, we have declarations. Other states have affidavits. And in a lot of cases, the judge isn't reading that, they're hearing your testimony. But if you get used to thinking, this is what the judge really needs to know. And I also have chances to speak to judges. And one of the things they complain about is, I don't know what this person wants. I don't know where they're going. And it helps them if you can say, these are my 3 biggest concerns, and these are 3 strongest examples, but I have a lot of others, and that's why my thing's 10 pages long. But you need to know up front about this. Now, this is what I was getting at. And that is that because of this presumption of equality or traditionally high conflict families, is to say, Your Honor, I know that in a lot of cases that the focus is how we can co-parent and cooperate and that both parents are equal contributors to problems. I want you to know this case is different. In this case, this person is acting way out of bounds, and I'm doing everything I can to be reasonable, and I have a history of that. And I want to present to you why this is not an ordinary case. Because that's there, the judge, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but it's like they have mailboxes in their head for cases. It's like, oh, this is a soccer case.
Right.
And so pretty quickly they peg the case, put it in their brain, and now go, okay, what do I do in this kind of case? Rather than this is a different case. This is a case with dynamics that are really one way. And it's sad. But the other thing is, and I came up with this after I stopped representing clients. So I've heard from other lawyers that it's a helpful approach. But I don't want to guarantee it, and person has to see if they think it fits. But to say to the court, I understand that in a high conflict case where there's allegations of bad behavior, that you have to consider three theories of the case. One is that allegation of bad behavior is true. Domestic violence, substance abuse, parental alienation, false allegations, child abuse, all of that, that could be true. The second, you have to consider that that's not at all true, and the person making those allegations is the person who's acting badly.
Right.
And the third possibility is maybe both are acting badly. Well, Your Honor, I want to explain why this is the second category in my case. This is a case of false allegations. Like I've had many domestic violence perpetrators accuse the mothers of child abuse.
Yep.
Or of gatekeeping and blocking
Alienation. Yep.
And so they come in and the spotlight is on mom.
Right.
And so mom's like, oh my goodness, it's not true. It's not true. And the judge is thinking, well, the theory of this case is that mom is abusing the kids. And that's all they're thinking about. So mom says it's not true. It's not true. And the judge is like, well, she's denying it. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's not true. But the judge isn't thinking there's two other possibilities here. And that's what's missing so much in family court is to go, wait a minute, this is a whole different case from that one that you've just been thinking about. This is a case where somebody's lying to you, pointing the finger at me when they're actually being abusive. And so the judge is like, I don't know if this is true or not. Oh, I don't know which theory fits this case. Now I've got an open mind. And there's this thing called confirmation bias. I give seminars on it to family law professionals. Confirmation bias is you have one theory of a case and you'll tend to prove your theory, even if it's not true, because you focus on things that look like your theory. You kind of ignore stuff that contradicts your theory, and vague things, you kind of squeeze it into your theory. And I've had cases that were totally misidentified because of that. So if the person could say, Your Honor, I believe you have to consider three possibilities going on in a high conflict case with allegations of bad behavior. This one, this one, this one. And now the judge's mind is hopefully a little more open.
This is great. No, this is great. Bill, I wish I could talk to you for the whole day. I mean, this is such good information for our professionals to talk to their clients about, to talk to their lawyers, for them to talk to the lawyers. We do have some attorneys also who watch this, and I just I would love you to come back sometime. I mean, because I could keep asking you there's so much great information here. So I really, really appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise. It's going to help a lot of people. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Can I mention we have 6 one-hour videos about domestic violence in family court with 16 experts. We interviewed 16 experts and talked about all of these different issues, like should you go to mediation, presenting your case, treatment, um, shelters, victim assistance programs through the police, etc. So if they go to our website and look for those 6 one-hour videos that they may find pretty helpful.
And it's at highconflictinstitute.com.
Yeah, so highconflictinstitute.com, and then there's tabs to look for online training, stuff like that, resources.
That's awesome. Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. And maybe we'll, post them on our site too.
Sure.
So thank you so much for all that you do and for sharing it with us today. And to my audience, thank you for being with Bill and myself on this episode of Divorce Coalition Live. If you'd like to listen to this episode again, you can find the link at divorcecoalition.com live show tab. All of Bill's information will be available in the show notes, and we'll put those links to those videos there too. We have a special gift for you, a free ebook called Stop Condoning Domestic Violence at divorcecoalition.com/stop-condoning-ebook. I so enjoyed being your host. I'm Jill Kaufman again, and my website is divorcecoachjill.com. And you can find the Divorce Coalition at divorcecoalition.com. Please like and share our Instagram page at Divorce Coalition page, and join us in the fight to change an abuse survivor's divorce journey. Stay tuned in 2 weeks on Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern for another episode of Divorce Coalition Live. Until next time, help us spread the word that divorce needs to change to create a more supportive and less traumatic divorce experience.